5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
How about we do it again?
6, 7, 4, 3, 2, 1. I think I farted.
Okay, let's try one more
I
time.
definitely.
Ready?
I can move you. Making review.
Say 6,
6,
5,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to the first of a two-part episode of Ranknreview, where my guest Jason Dubray and I are going to discuss what we believe to be the top 25 horror movies of the 1990s. Buckle up, it's going to be a wild and crazy ride. I know there's probably some of you out there wondering, well, doesn't Lee Beckman always do these episodes? And there is a percentage of truth to that, but we decided to mix it up a little bit this time, and hopefully we will agree that we did pretty good justice to it. And Jason and I have much differing tastes than Lee and I, where I can imagine Lee and I doing an episode on the 90s and it being almost the same list. Say what you will about our lists, you guys, but they're not the same. So I hope you guys enjoy that. I hope you're prepared to duck in for 2 full episodes so that we can get this done good and proper. As usual, there will be spoilers for these 6 movies that we actually review, and we will be commenting on a lot of the movies that we talk about throughout the 90s. So hopefully you're horror movie savvy, and hopefully you don't mind a fairly spoiler-ish discussion on some of these movies. You can let me know how I did or how Jason did by writing me at ranknreview@gmail.com. That's ranknreview@gmail.com. I'm your host and I'm Canadian Larry Parsons. And again, sorry for the swears, sorry for the spoilers, but I do not apologize for my podcast. Jason Dubray, thank you so much for being back with us on Ranknreview to discuss the 1990s, that decade, as how we feel about horror in the 1990s. You expressed a great interest in doing one of these, epic decade-long examinations, and I want to just say, coming through the door, just to be honest, I don't want you to think I didn't do my due diligence. I did watch a lot of 90s movies, but this was a decade, unlike the 70s, for instance, where there wasn't a lot of gaps for me. I've always watched a lot of movies, but in the 90s, before I had kids, before life was really kicking in a serious way, I watched a lot of movies. So, whereas with the 70s list, I felt like I had all these gaps I needed to fill. And this one, it was more about revisiting certain things and trying to figure out where the list was going to land. So I didn't rewatch or rediscover a bunch of movies this time out the way I did with the 70s and a little bit with the 80s, because I guess the 90s were, like I said, the apex of my collecting movies and watching movies time. Like, unfortunately, I would argue, at least compared to the other decades I've examined so far, the 90s weren't super amazing when it comes to horror. It wasn't the strongest decade. The Kevin Williamson effect, the Scream effect, as it were. Not that he hadn't seen sort of satire and comedy within horror before. It started to kind of take over a little bit in the 90s. It was like the 90s were too cool in a lot of ways to make an honest horror movie. So when a real one showed up, we could make a meal out of it.
Yeah.
What did you think about 90s cinemas, and why have you decided to put yourself in this position?
Well, because the 90s... And I think I've mentioned this on some shows before. The 90s are when I became a full-on movie geek. Early 90s. So I feel like I identify with that decade the most. I feel like that's when I, like you were saying, watched endless movies, bought tons of movies, started a huge collection, which continues to this day. which is funny because life hasn't sped up for me in some ways. So I'm in the same situation. I'm not responsible for kids or anything right now, but I go back to the 90s as being like that was the time for me. The time that I wish I could have fully experienced was the 70s.
Right.
So to me, those are the two best decades for movies, at least as far as movies in color and that I haven't been a huge fan of. There's the odd movie here or there in the 21st century. Yeah. So I feel like kind of the last great decade for movies was the 90s. At the same time, I would agree with you that for horror, you had more options in the 1990s or 1980s in the 1990s. And I think some of the things you're mentioning here is, and just coming up with this list, and I talked to you about it a little bit, about some people might get mad at me that some of my picks may not be ones that immediately click and think that's a horror movie.
Right.
Because I feel like the genres started to overlap a bit in the 90s, and I think that's that cool factor you're talking about. We can't just have a slasher movie, just to have a slasher movie. We have to have sort of a social comment about violence because movies were being attacked by politicians on both sides all throughout that decade.
It wasn't enough to just have a crazy, weird creature feature anymore. Yeah. There had to be more to it than that. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the 80s, I mean, I've talked before about, Jason Voorhees basically being a Republican mascot if you wanted it to be. He punishes promiscuous sex and drug use, right? But I think in the 90s there was this almost shame to it. There was almost stink on it. You either had to be making fun of it or making a comment on it and be ironic, and that definitely dulls your horror. So much so that I think in the aughts we kind of swung, the pendulum swung to the other extreme, and all of a sudden torture porn started becoming the flavor of the week again. This is
you kind of blame Scream?
Well, I think it's just, there was the aftermath.
There's another movie from another decade that I would...
Yeah, but, it gets darker, obviously, the aftermath of 9/11. The horror movies start getting a little bit uglier. But I do think that Scream made horror movies so safe for so long that people started to long for a horror movie that wasn't safe anymore.
Yeah.
And that's mainly how I feel about a lot of 90s horror. It's safe. And even a lot of the stuff that is really influential and impactful, comparatively safe by today's standards. We're going to talk about The Silence of the Lambs. I said this before when we talked about it on the show. I think it's an amazing movie, but I think by today's standards, because Silence of the Lambs basically had this ripple effect throughout cinema. If Silence of the Lambs came out today, it would be boring. It would be a snore, basically, for most people. It was just
it was the pioneer for...
It brought, sort of the hard, ugly, dark procedural sort of to the forefront again. But
now, mainstream television jumped on that. Criminal Minds is a show that...
It's Silence of the Lambs every week. Yeah. Every night, every week is basically some sort of derivation of Silence of the Lambs.
It stays on the air for...
I'm not saying Silence of the Lambs is a bad movie. In fact, I think it's a fantastic movie. But I think its impact has been lessened by time. I think that's just a true statement. And I'm starting to see, some of these are starting to look more dog-eared. Some of them are starting to feel dated in the way 80s movies feel dated. So far in a kind of charming way. But it's interesting how quickly that starts to happen, too. It's not like these movies were made in the 50s. They're made in the 90s. But some of them are kind of almost comically outdated already.
They aren't as... Mind you, I'm not easily scared.
Right.
Horror movies from the 1970s actually did scare me. Not as much in the 1990s. Yet when I first saw these, it's one of those... I've heard you describe this before. Seeing these movies and understanding them, as a preteen, as a teen, and then going back as an adult, and it's like, should I have been watching that when I was that age?
Maybe it didn't affect us when we were younger because it couldn't affect us when we were younger the same way it can when we've lived a bit of a life.
But you're right. I don't think 15-year-old horror fans, if Silence of the Lambs was released this weekend, would...
What's this?
I do think that critics would still jump on it as being a great movie.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I was wrestling with the lists, was there were some movies. This is a great movie. Is it a great horror movie? And then is this a better? Am I thinking that this is a better horror movie, or should be higher on my list because it's a great movie, or is it actually scary compared to the other one? So that's something I was kind of balancing out, which I don't know if you needed to balance that out as much with.
My list is pretty personal. There's a couple of inclusions. I can hear the Beckmans of the world yelling at their iPhone or whatever. But
well, you might be really yelling at my list too. So that's fine.
I'm curious to see what it is. Is there anything else you want to say about the 90s as an introduction?
Well, I just want to say something about the 2010s here. I hope you invite me for that show so that I can put Book of Trespasses on the list, because that's you've made this movie that takes some familiar stuff from horror movies of the past, but does it in such a unique way. So I want to do a shout out to that as well.
Thank you. This episode of Ranknreview is brought to you in part by Book of Trespasses.
Book of Trespasses. I think you said that at a screening. We're supposed to say that how many times a day? 5 times a day?
As much as you can. Just like Book of Trespasses in the conversation. Thank you so much. October 27th, we're going to have another screening at the Broadway Theatre in Saskatchewan.
Everybody should go.
If you can.
If you're listening to this and you are in New York City.
Yeah.
To Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. It's the event of the year in Saskatoon. So.
Thank you, dude. I appreciate that. Jumping the needle, the 6 movies that we're going to talk about to cover the decade of the 90s. I've noticed a lot of them are very early in the 90s. The Exorcist Part 3, I believe 1990.
Yep.
Nightbreed, I believe 1990.
90 as well, yeah.
Silence of the Lambs.
91.
I believe 91, yeah. And then we're going to talk about the director's cut of Mimic. We're going to talk about Jacob's Ladder.
Jacob's Ladder was 91 as well.
91 as well.
Mimic was later on.
And what did I miss?
Blair Witch Project.
The Blair Witch Project, of course, from 1999. But it's interesting how we're focusing, or at least the picks that we came up to discuss, most of them, 90 and 91. So,
it may be the offshoot of late 80s.
Who knows? It could be residual 80s creeping in, or it could just be, like I say, the Scream effect. Movies were less scary towards the middle of the 90s.
Yeah.
I think that, in a way, what made the Blair Witch such a refreshing to drink, was above the shaky camera, above the stylistic approach, above everything else, it was scary. And I think it had been a while since the public had been subjected to something that was honestly frightening.
Mm-hmm.
The search of the 3 missing Montgomery College students continues in Frederick County tonight.
10 days and thousands of man-hours have been unable to produce any clues.
We have a few leads, a few other options we want to take advantage of, and just try to put together some pieces to this puzzle.
Do you believe the occult may be involved in the disappearance of your son?
I'm so scared.
All right, so Blair Witch, I guess we shouldn't talk about where they rank because I'm not sure where they're going to edit. But we put them in very different spots on the list, as it turns out. But I both think we have a lot of respect for it.
Yes.
It's interesting how much this was lightning in a bottle, because it would seem like this was really easy. They just got a bunch of kids, threw them out in the woods, scared the shit out of them. They filmed it themselves, no DOP, no script supervision. They shot hours and hours of footage, and they just cut it down to the scariest 80 minutes that they could.
Yep.
That sounds like it would be easy to do, Jason, but it is not fucking easy to do.
As you know, outdoor locations are not fun.
Shooting outside is the worst. It'll be easy. We'll just shoot in some random stretch of woods. No problem. Just plug into a tree somewhere. But then you look at where it went, just like the Blair Witch franchise alone, let alone like found footage. The immediate sequel, Book of Shadows, was an absolute debacle. An absolute embarrassing debacle.
Yes. Almost
to the level of Exorcist II: The Heretic. Like, it's as bad as this movie is good. And then the third Blair Witch movie, which had a really decent director and creative team behind it, I think is only about 50% there. I think the second half of that movie works really well. Unfortunately, by the time we get to it, the movie's really pissed me off.
Oh, yeah.
So for me, it always comes back to this first Blair Witch project. I remember there's an accompanying documentary you get on the DVD that they aired on the Space Channel here and Sci-Fi Network in the States, which purported to be one of these faux documentaries about a real legend of the Blair Witch. And I don't think you can underserve how important creating this back history narrative was for making this Blair Witch movie feel more authentic. I think just by the fact that you paid your ticket money and you were seeing this on a big screen, on some level, unless you're just a very willfully naive person, you know that this isn't a snuff film you're watching, that these kids didn't really die. But it was really easy to allow yourself to believe it. The separation between, the fiction on the screen seemed closer. Even in a movie like Jurassic Park, you understand you're in the hands of a great filmmaker. Steven Spielberg is going to show you people being eaten by dinosaurs.
Yeah.
They couldn't do that, but they made a movie every bit as scary.
It's just so authentic. It's true horror, but it's also it's these young people making a movie that they want to make a movie, and they came up with a great concept. For me, I'm more scared about what I don't see as opposed to what I do see, which is why David Lynch is such an effective filmmaker, which we talk about throughout. But I just admire this film. I almost wonder because again, I mentioned it was up for Razzie Awards, and I was totally confused by that because I loved it. I thought it was a genuinely scary idea. To me, it's a little bit scarier watching it on some bootleg VHS in your home. Some movies are better on the big screen. Some movies are better at home in the dark. Found footage is better in the dark at home.
It's a home viewing experience works better. I honestly think, as much as like the Paranormal Activity was sold on, look at how much fun people are having in the theaters, I think that movie is scary in the middle of the afternoon at home, right?
Well, I watched that one when I was renting a house, but I was the only person home. I watched it at something like 11 p.m., midnight. Yeah. And I could not sleep. It's the rare movie where I actually could not sleep afterwards. Right. But I've heard people, much like the Blair Witch, just completely complain that it's a terrible film. Yeah. And Blair Witch is not. One of the things I wonder about is I don't know if they had union people involved with this. If maybe there was a backlash from the industry that a movie could be this successful, made by
there was
truly independent.
This spider under thing going on in the 90s, largely started by Steven Soderbergh and his success with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and Richard Linklater with Slacker and Dazed and Confused and all of this, where all of a sudden you could just be some guy who made a movie and it would get picked up. So I think that the indie filmmaking thing, this seems to go in peaks and valleys generally. Yeah. Right now, we're definitely at the other end of the spectrum where...
everybody with a phone can make a film.
Yeah, everybody with a phone can make a film, but they're not being embraced in the same way that they were in the 90s. No. I think at some point people will get sick enough of the next superhero or the next Star Wars movie that they're going to be hungry for some indie filmmaker to blow people's minds again. But we're not quite there yet. But tick, 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 tick,
well,
tick.
Particularly with horror, I think you can make an argument with Get Out that there is this craving for a genre movie like that. No, they had a little bit more money. Well, probably quite a bit more money than Blair Witch did. But I really enjoy this film. And it just depends on the situation. I've watched it and I've been really I felt uncomfortable in the right way watching it. So other times I watch and why do I love this movie so much? And then I will give it some time in between, and then I'll watch it again and no, they were on the cutting edge here. And to me, it's a movie that pioneered a subgenre, and there are a lot of films now that owe their success and more success than Blair Witch has experienced.
And if they didn't pioneer it, they perfected it.
Yeah.
And they definitely popularized it.
Well, I mean mockumentaries,
Yeah.
but those were not, the purpose is comedy.
Typically.
But this, I don't recall. Now, mind you, I haven't seen every horror movie of all time, so I mean, I'm not sure I'm gonna get there.
Holocaust from
Yeah,
77,
you could
and
argue
arguably
that.
Peeping Tom from 67.
Okay.
Although that movie's not complete forced perspective, just for the specific murder scenes that they are. And then, of course, there's the opening to Halloween. There's the opening to Black Christmas. Like, the forced perspective had been used before, but it hadn't been the whole enchilada necessarily, right? The entire movie. And just the way it's told. Yes, they had some scripts, but like they would, for people who were telling stories at the beginning of the movie about the Blair Witch, they would say, here's the story. And they would tell the person the story, and they would ask that person to repeat that story in their own words.
These are real people.
Exactly.
Well, and there's the one scene where they go up to this property and you can tell the person who owns it is not comfortable. Like who are these people showing up in my house? To me, that felt very real.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of stuff in here that feels real and makes it more horrifying in the fact that we, don't really see the Blair Witch.
Which is a brave, tough choice.
Yeah,
like,
but that's so good.
We hear everything we need to about the movie. It's the other found footage movie that this has a direct influence on, I've talked about in the past. Willow Creek, which was directed by Bobcat Goldthwait. Again, you could lay Willow Creek on top of this movie, and it's almost the same movie, beat for beat. I still really like Willow Creek, but you can
Blair Witch
feel that. But Blair Witch, I like the way that they approached the naturalistic dialogue. They would say, you have to make your way to this point, and then they find the sticks hanging in the trees, and the actors react naturally to just discovering the sticks in the trees. They get to another plot point, and then one of them, Michael C. Williams' character, is told, okay, confess to that you deliberately lost the map.
Yeah.
And then that scene happens, right? But it's interesting how stuff changed through the production. When they were making the movie originally as scripted, Michael was the one that went missing first, not Josh. But Josh and Heather's relationship had become so ugly that they decided we better get rid of Josh first. And that sort of
that came from the improvisation,
like where it was coming from. Also, like I said, hours and hours of footage that they had to bear down. What I really love about this is that it was the strength of the concept and the idea. To take nothing away from the actors, again, I think they do a really, really good job. The story is everything here. I mean, people can talk about, the forced perspective. They can talk about, Heather's crying and snotting all over the lens and everything like that. But what makes the movie scary is the Blair Witch. And what makes the movie really scary is that we never see the Blair Witch.
Yeah.
And that's great. Unfortunately, the only actor that has come really, Joshua Leonard, has been coming up in the world, and I've actually, he did an episode of True Detective. He did the remake of oh my God, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. He's in the new Steven Soderbergh movie. So he's actually coming up in the world. So I'm glad to see it. But Heather Donahue just got raked over the coals for this movie.
Yeah, wasn't she up for Worst Actress or something?
She was nominated for Worst Actress for the Razzies and all of this. And as far as I'm
misjudge this movie so
this is
badly.
what it looks like when somebody completely falls apart. And no, it's not pretty, and no, it's not nice to listen to, but it's authentic. And people are so used to not seeing authenticity on the screen that when they get it, they react badly to it. It's just so used to seeing the cute, precocious Hollywood little toddler that when you see a real toddler, the math doesn't work out for you, right?
Yeah.
Same thing here. If somebody is gone to the point where they're so desperate that they're almost losing their mind and composure, it's not a pretty thing to witness. It shouldn't be a pretty thing to witness. And I think it's arguably one of the harder things to execute as a performer authentically. And I think she did a fantastic job of it. Now, whether or not Heather's a likable character, we can have that
but
conversation.
She's not. I mean, she's very manipulative. She doesn't give these guys the whole story of what she's doing. But
that's why people don't like the performance, though, because they don't
because
like
she
the
was.
character.
It was because she was so good at playing that character. And I think the other maybe slight problem with them not being known was people thought, oh, these are just the actors are the characters that they play.
Yeah.
Oh, and this is just what she's like, and she's just a horrible person, and I don't like her. And it's
all the characters share the same first name as the actors who play them. That was a deliberate choice. Yeah. But I honestly think...
And I don't think it's a bad choice.
People conflate her difficult character with it being a bad performance. And I think it's a good performance of a difficult character. And I think the big win for her character is that she acknowledges it. She says in that confession, like, I'm sorry to my parents. I'm sorry to everyone's parents. It was my fault. It was my decision. It was my project. I insisted on everything. I led us to this. And it's like you have a Cooper character, like a Night of the Living Dead character, who is at least self-aware enough to acknowledge they fucked up. Most of the time, they'll just stubbornly stomp their feet and say, no! I think it was actually a real win for her character. I mean, she didn't win, obviously, but for her personally to acknowledge that, no, I insisted on having it my way, and this is what my way got us.
And I guess that scene I have trouble with. And it didn't bother me. Yeah, it didn't bother me the first time I saw it, but I was taking the whole thing in. And even now, when I watched it again, and I was like, I got back to where I was in '99 with this film, liking it quite a bit. That part of it feels a little bit scripted, a little bit too inauthentic. I like that you have a character who is, admitting to her faults. Like if I do something like really, really horrible, and I don't know why I did that, and then afterwards I'm apologizing to someone. That's how people operate. Yeah. Most people operate that way. So I'd like having the scene in there, but it felt like it was a little bit too much like a speech that she had prepared, as opposed to somebody who is honestly kind of owning up to what she's done. So, I like that it's in there, but there's just some aspects of that part that bother me a bit. Not enough to hate the movie as much as people seem to have.
Being reminded of Blair Witch Project when I'm watching different movies, and sometimes surprising movies. Just over my vacation, I watched The Shallows with my wife and my mom.
Oh yeah.
It's a shark movie. Feel good picture. Actually, really liked it. But there's a scene where she's about to swim from her rock to this buoy out in the middle of the water, and she knows there's a really good chance that she's going to die, and she has this GoPro, and she records a goodbye and an apology to her family, and right away I like Blair Witch Project.
Is that stolen from it, or
I don't know if it's stolen,
or just subconsciously it's maybe crept in?
But that's kind of the same scene, right? She got herself in this position. She insisted that she wanted to, go find this beach, and when her friend was too drunk to join her, she went anyway. She was there by herself, and she got herself into this terrible position. She acknowledges it. She says goodbye to her family because she assumes she's going to die, and she sort of throws this message in a bottle out to the ocean. And that's exactly how I felt about the scene in the Blair Witch Project. She doesn't know that anyone's going to find the footage. It's just something she's preparing herself for her inevitable fate. I think at that point they know they're not going to be able to walk out of the woods. We didn't really talk plot. I just assume everybody's seen the Blair Witch Project, but they go to investigate a local legend. They start wandering around in the woods, and they find that they can't get out of it. They're clearly being fucked with by some supernatural force.
At first I think they're just lost and they're blaming each other, but
they slowly come to realize that they're just under her spell or under her whatever. And it's creepy. It's creepy without showing us any of the gore at all, really. We hear stories about people being disemboweled. We hear a story about a witch that floats through the woods and has hair like a horse. We hear all of these tales, and that's enough to scare us. It goes back to the very basic, essential element, what I love about movies and what I love generally about horror fiction. Do you have a good story to tell? Because if you have a good story to tell, you can make it for a few $100 and it will conquer the world if it's good enough a story. If you don't have a story to tell, David Lynch, it just goes nowhere.
feel like that should be the last line there that I should be allowed to respond to.
You're
this
allowed
one.
to respond. I'm sorry, it was a cheap shot at David Lynch. But,
Yeah, that seems to be the Lee Beckman controlling our minds here and fighting over David Lynch is what this has become. But
the bullet point is that Blair Witch lives up to the hype. I think that it's kind of our generation's Texas Chainsaw Massacre in a lot of ways, in that if you didn't see it when it came out, of the time it came out, its strengths might not be immediately obvious. It's important for when it came out of that time. But no movie in the 90s scared me as much as the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah,
So-
fair enough. The thing I do want to say that I think people, whether you go along with the whole story of the witch and all that, a lot of people go camping.
Yes.
And there's still something very, very creepy about going camping and the silence of it. And then you start to hear things. And so the movie also works on that level. And we have these, because of the camera, they're filming a lot in this tent. And like, what is going on outside of this tent?
What you imagine will be worse than anything they could show you.
It's like going to summer camp, and there's this kindly woman that turns out to be Jason's mother. There,
Yes.
so yeah,
And it's
It
just
works.
this weird conceit that you're sleeping in the middle of this wilderness, in the middle of this darkness, in the middle of this wildness. And what's protecting you? A tiny, thin scrap of pat fabric.
yes.
Anything that wants in to get you
Oh,
is just
of course.
going to go in and get you.
Yeah, it's not going to protect you from a bear.
It's like hiding under a blanket when a bear attacks you.
Yeah.
Right? It's just not going to do
or the
it.
monster in your closet.
Exactly.
And you're hiding under your safe blanket. Well,
Yeah. At the end of the day, we're not supposed to be traipsing out in the woods, so don't do it.
yeah.
Alright, so it's time for us to rank our top 25 horror movies of the 90s.
All right.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
We'll talk about some special mentions after we finish the list, but
I probably had about a top 30, I would
Yeah.
say, with regrets that there were some other ones too that I
I
didn't
just
get in.
sort of made decisions, and we'll talk about it afterwards, of things that I would and would not include on the list. And
This is the best. If I did this for another week, I'd be agonizing over it. I don't know how much change there would be. There would be a little bit of change, but I think this is what it is. It'd be good.
All right. Well, what was your number 25 ranked
Okay,
film? of
number
the
25, and this one, some people might think it should be higher up here, is the Blair Witch Project. Then my number 24 is...
90s? Let's just start.
Or do we want to talk
25th
about-
place is
25th is the Blair Witch Project,
Okay.
yeah.
So obviously it ranks much higher for me than you, but how do you feel about it generally?
It's one I'm mixed on. I actually like the lead-up experience, having been around when the movie was released, and I actually it was almost like something from the movie. There was a kind of bootleg VHS that was going around Saskatoon at the time that I was able to borrow from the previously mentioned Mr. Beckman.
Yes.
And so I watched it, and it was freaky, and there hadn't been anything like this before. But I knew that it was a movie. Spoilers are, that it was a movie. This wasn't something that actually happened.
It was presented as if it was a true thing, but obviously found.
This is a really long story, but and then we could get into it when we talk about the movie a little bit more. But I had a manager who I was really good friends with at Rainbow Cinemas at the time, and he was having kind of a guys' weekend. And I'd mentioned this movie, and I said, like, this is going to be big this year. It's coming out in
the summer.
It's coming out in the summer, but we have it early. I could show you this. We watched it, and then I told him at the end, no, these were actors, and this was all a setup. And so we watched it with his friends, and it freaked the hell out of them. And I wasn't staying over. Others were staying over. And then I came back the next day I'm not sure what we were doing the next day. And so I show up and I say, okay, so how did you react when Todd told you that the whole thing was fake? And these guys looked at him and wanted to kill him. Said, he didn't tell us. I didn't sleep a wink last night. And I was just like, it worked. I mean, before everything else happened, it was effective, but it was maybe effective
for that
in that form. I don't remember being quite as freaked out by it, oddly enough, when I saw it in the movie theater.
Right.
And watching it again recently, I liked it more because it got Razzie nominations. It was actually not well received.
There are people
who
loved
loved it and people who hated it.
Exactly.
I was more on the loved it side. And over time I thought, was it just kind of the gimmick? Did I fall for the gimmick? And because I watched it a lot that year, in 99 I think. But watching it this time, I'm like, it still is a well-made horror movie. But I just happen to like a bunch of other films more. And
fair enough.
And again, some of these that I mentioned, you might say that's not actually a horror movie. And Blair Witch should be ahead of that. So
let's save that reaction till you hear my 25th rank.
Yep.
In the bottom of this, I made a special place for a So Bad It's Good movie. I'm not saying that this is a great movie. I'm saying that this is an incredibly entertaining, stupid movie. Mm-hmm. I'll give an honorable mention to Anaconda, but Anaconda's not on the list.
Okay.
Deep Blue Sea.
Holy!
This
no!
Tale of sharks that are being made bigger and smarter in order to solve Alzheimer's is also a not so subtle parable on the evils of silence and the benefits of religious faith. It's completely ludicrous.
It is.
LL Cool J is in the movie. Almost every time he's on screen, you just want to rip your own face free of your skull. But it's also like so crazy and so moment to moment bonkers that I do genuinely find it entertaining. So in my Lonely So Bad It's Good nomination in 25th place.
We're gonna have different. We are gonna have different lists.
Fair enough.
The thing I remember was
Sam
Jackson at that point. I mean, he was still kind of in the phase when he was doing serious movies. He wasn't going for the paycheck like he's pretty much through the 21st century has been. So that might be a bit of an over whatever. Because I was at a point where I thought he was one of the best actors around, off of Jungle Fever and Pulp Fiction. I thought his performance in A Time to Kill, for example, was highly underrated.
I've said on the record on this show, having Samuel Jackson is good for your movie.
I'm not sure it was good in this case because he has one of his monologues, and my friend and I, we watched it at a drive-in. I think we missed about 20 minutes of the movie because after this monologue happens, we lost it. We burst out laughing and could not control ourselves, and
that's the reaction I would expect. That's why I'm recommending the movie. Not because you're going to be...
It's entertaining.
It's entertaining.
There you go. I'll give you that.
Completely stupid, but it's entertaining.
Yeah.
So yeah. And
so Anaconda would have been in that type
similar
of
sort of place.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think that movie is terrible, and I think that movie is wonderful.
I'd put Anaconda. Neither are on my list, but I would put Anaconda ahead of...
Deep Blue Sea.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I also have this shark thing, but anyway.
Yeah.
What's your 24th position?
24th, I went with Ringu, so that's the Japanese...
The
original version of The Ring. In my opinion, a scarier version of The Ring from beginning to end. It really, really stays with you. Again, I'm not sure it scared me because I knew the story ahead of time. But I think in its original form, it's a better film than the American.
Can I ask what you saw first?
I saw the American one first.
Oh, interesting. So did I, and that's why I thought I just preferred that version, and I always just assumed if I'd seen the original first, I'd prefer the original.
Yeah, it's weird that. Yeah,
and that usually is the case most of the time. But I felt like the original gave us a little bit more of a backstory to hang all of the spookiness on. But solid choice. I won't fight you on that.
Well, I just talked about how much I like the backstory in your movie. Yet somehow for that movie, I don't feel that I need as much of a backstory. It's just
sometimes less is more.
Really creepy.
Asian cinemas, like a lot of the, especially these ghost stories that you see out of like Japan and Korea, they almost feel like what it would be if David Lynch could actually make a horror movie instead of just a David Lynch movie. You know what I mean? Like, they're really weird and really scary, and they in a way that helps the movie. In 24th position for me, again, this one people would debate: is it a horror movie? Is it not? Kenneth Branagh's Dead Again.
Oh, okay.
It's more of a, I guess, supernatural psychological thriller. I mean, there's some violence to it, there's some suspense to it, but it's basically, it was Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson basically announcing themselves as arriving in Hollywood. They've been doing great work in England. Now they'd come overseas to conquer, and I've always really liked the movie. It's kind of got a convoluted plot, but it's balanced really well. Really great cast, and Branagh doing this quite impressive act, like he would throughout his career, of centering, both as an actor and a director, a quite impressive spiraling narrative. So, Dead Again, big fan. Also, uncredited performance from Robin Williams, who
yes,
we had mentioned as well. I've always loved that movie.
We should have had him on our Robin Williams that movie, because that performance was better than some of the ones we were talking about.
Yeah, I guess.
And it was so different for him, that character that he plays in Dead Again.
Yeah.
I really liked that film. When I was preparing for this, I went and rewatched it, and I kind of ruled it out because I thought it wasn't enough of a horror movie.
Right.
Yet everything you're saying about it is terrific, and I felt like a few films that might be mentioned here, the influence of Hitchcock in that film was felt, and it was in very good hands. So it's a great selection. It's a terrific film.
You're not fighting me on that one.
No, I'm not. I kind of wish I could put it on here. I just had ruled it out so early on that good choice.
Fair enough. What's your next selection?
23, and I was wrestling with this one. This one is an out-and-out horror movie, and it is Candyman. Okay. Yeah, it's. I watched it years ago, and I remember liking it enough, but I needed to rewatch it to, just to get some details clear and to just decide does it belong on this list or not. And I told some people that I was considering this for the show, and they're like, Candyman, really? Like. Seems like there's maybe a little bit. Not everybody likes it. I just found it to be a true horror movie. It has the gore. It has the character. It has an interesting backstory, which impacts the main part. Virginia Madsen's in it, and I've always liked her. She doesn't get enough work. I mean, she kind of showed up years later in Sideways, but nothing much has happened since then for her.
She was usually sort of like the hot, naughty girl in a lot of movies. What I really like about Candyman is that she got to show off. She can center a movie and do it well. She did. I think that movie's creepy. Yeah.
It is creepy, yeah. So I think it's a true horror movie that I put on this list.
All right, so number 23, again, once again, we're talking about a movie that couldn't maybe be called a horror movie 100%, but it's a movie that's memorable from the 90s and that I do think has horrifying elements to it. Yes, from the director of Batman and Robin, Falling Down.
Oh, Falling Down!
Starring Michael Douglas.
Oh, cool.
It's basically about a dude who's been laid off from his job and has been pretending to go to work for several days. And on the day of his daughter's birthday, he snaps. He's stuck in gridlock, and he's just trying to get a present for his daughter and, find a way to get to her. And he ends up walking across Los Angeles in an increasingly frightening and violent journey where pretty much anybody who crosses his path is in some real danger. So it's got sort of I want to say Taxi Driver edge, but it's not Taxi Driver. No, it's not a fair thing to put, but I think that it's trying to say something, and it's a pretty subversive, bold thriller. Yes. And I think Michael Douglas is really strong in it. I think Robert Duvall's really strong in it. And it's one of the ones that I can use in defense of Schumacher, because Schumacher takes a lot of hits. And
he's actually a very good director.
Yeah.
He's a very good director. He might be mentioned later on in my list. Not this specific film.
Right.
But I'm really liking your list. Right. I mean, it's different than mine. but I like where you're going with it because it's real life horror.
Yes. The other one that I wanted to mention, I don't include it on the list, but in the way I mentioned Anaconda next to Deep Blue Sea, I'll mention this California with a K. It's like the most 90s movie you can watch. It's like almost like garishly 90s, but it's about this two couples that go on a road trip to visit famous murder scenes. And it's an examination of the psychology of the two couples, and Brad Pitt playing a particularly disgusting sociopath.
It's one of his best performances.
It's an interesting movie. I think that there are problems with it, but if you liked Falling Down, have a look at California.
Yeah, it might be mentioned a little bit later on. It might be, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
22.
Okay, 22. Really, to me, this was quite an inventive indie horror movie that, again, had a double meaning, like a lot of films in the 90s, horror movies in the 90s, The Addiction. And it was very much, the whole thing was an allegory for the AIDS epidemic, which in the 1990s they were paying a lot more attention to, but using vampires. And I think it's a great cast. Christopher Walken's in there, and filmed in black and white. It's a terrific film. So
Abel Ferrara is one of those really interesting directors, like strangely weird in the sort of peaks and valleys to the quality of his movies. I might have to revisit that one. It's been a while since I've seen it, but
it's not perfect. But
I remember
it's a small film, but it's I think it has the impact of some of his.
It's of the subset of these like art house vamp movies, you know.
That was kind of the mid '90s type of offshoot. So, and that was another one of these movies that Christopher Walken showed up in about half of the horror movies. And then,
well, here's the one. I think if we were going to do it, if I was doing this with Lee Backman, this is the one where he would just storm out of the room saying, "That's not a horror movie. This is a stupid pick." But speaking of Christopher Walken, have you ever seen The Prophecy?
Oh yeah, The Prophecy. Yeah, no, I will go with you on that.
Like, I know it's not a smart movie. It's from the writer of Highlander, you know, and it's about angels fighting each other. But there was something so crazy about the movie and so richly imagined. And at the time, a really strong, hot cast, right? And then you've got Virginia Madsen again, who we just talked about from Candyman, and a Canadian actor, Elias Koteas, sort of centering this completely bizarre horror fantasy. And I think what I love about Prophecy is not that it's an amazing movie, but that it's not easy to compare to anything else.
No, it's an original. So there aren't many of those.
For its originality and for, you know, my love of Christopher Walken, and for some just great isolated moments throughout, I put The Prophecy.
See, I think it's enough. I might say it's more of a horror movie than a couple of the others that you mentioned recently. Yet I know where you're going with a lot of these. And, yeah, the devil's in. Yes,
I think if Viggo Mortensen shows up as the devil, we can call it a horror.
It has got to be. Yeah. All right, we're in 21.
Yes.
Yeah, and Canadian movie. I believe it's Canadian. Correct me if I'm wrong. Cube.
It is a Canadian movie.
Yeah, and I have two movies that are kind of similar in look on this list, but and this one it's one that I had quite high up, and then I started thinking of other movies, and it kind of got pushed back a little bit. But
Vincenzo Natali is the director.
Yeah,
he's a good Canadian filmmaker. I like the movie between the fact that it's equal parts sci-fi and horror, and the fact that I think that the cast kind of lets us down a little bit. It didn't quite make the list for me, but I love that it's on your list because I've always loved that movie.
Yeah, it's one of these little movies that it kind of, it became bigger than it maybe had any right to be. Right. But it's kind of in a similar way to The Addiction. I thought about it afterwards. It's had an impact on me, and I just think it was very, very clever idea. Just things that could be tweaked.
As far as how to make a movie cheaply and that is high concept, it's a really good measure. Like, so much of the work is done in your head, but it's done so convincingly that you could convince yourself it was actually a big budget movie, which it was not. So yeah, no, you're not going to hear me fight back on that Cube at all. And 21 for me is a movie we are going to be talking about. It is the director's cut of Nightbreed from Clive Barker.
Yeah, we'll be talking about it.
The interesting thing about Clive Barker is that he's not a filmmaker, and I think when you watch his movies, that's pretty obvious. But what he does have is an incredible imagination, and I like these monster movies. I discovered the book at a fairly, probably too young age. And I thought it was amazing that this, famous British horror writer had set a movie in Canada. And when they made the movie, not only did they set it in and around Calgary, they shot it in and around Calgary. The outside of the cemetery where Boone is gunned down is walking distance from the small town where I grew up.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
I had all of this sort of personal connection to it, like being excited knowing that it was being made there.
Good.
And I guess as a young man, I just thought, I guess if monsters wanted to find a place to hide where no one would find them, I guess the middle of nowhere, northern Alberta, would be a pretty decent spot. Again, it's a flawed movie, much like I was talking about with The Prophecy, but I love the imagination in it, and I love the monsters in it, and I'd have a soft spot for Nightbreed, so there it sits.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Canadian stuff, because that will be
That'll
be the nice thing I say about it. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
It wasn't on my list at all.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Who's buried in Midian?
Ain't nothing but dead folk.
Somewhere, hidden from sight, closer than you might think, is a place that's not on any map. Midian.
Something's breeding there.
It looks a lot like hell, but they call it home.
There goes the neighborhood.
They're not pretty. They're not neighborly.
You'll come back now, you hear?
They're not even human. But this time, they're the good guys. From the imagination of Clive Barker comes Nightbreed.
You can't go down there!
They have only one enemy. A beast called man, sworn to destroy the Nightbreed.
Sounds like we're going head-to-head with the devil himself.
And only one chance. A man called Boone.
It's time to fight! Go get 'em, boys!
I get your feelings about Nightbreed. I can tell you're not a big fan of it, and I will absolutely stipulate there's lots of problems with this movie. Like there are, clearly. I have a lot of respect for David Cronenberg, the director. I have no respect for David Cronenberg, the actor. I'm sorry, it's mean, but it's just true. He isn't not much of an actor. In fact, it might be the one flaw in that Canadian film Last Night, Don McKellar directed. Yeah. He gave a part to David Cronenberg, and he delivers his lines in, I guess, a way that's not bad, but I don't think he's an actor. I think he's here to make interesting weirdo movies. Keep making your interesting weirdo movies. I get the feeling like Clive Barker was starstruck by the idea of working with David Cronenberg.
The legend,
and I think the mask that he wears, that weird buttonhole mask thing, is like fucking crazy evil looking. Yeah. But as a character and as a performance, that doesn't work. And he's like our main villain. So that's kind of a problem. I also think Craig Schaefer, as a leading man, I like him though. He's sort of good in the late 80s and early 90s. He played a lot of bully roles. He's sort of like these meathead type of character. And I guess that's just how I associated him. As him centering a whole movie. I don't know. He's fine, but he certainly doesn't blow me away. What blows me away about Nightbreed is sort of when I go back to talking about the Blair Witch Project. It's the imagination of the movie. It's the size and scale of the world. Like, it's a movie, but it could be a TV series. It's you have a feeling like this world is vast. And I think if given a proper budget and if it had an actual director, I like Clive Barker as a person who imagines stories and creatives. And I have a lot of respect. He directed Hellraiser, and he'd never made a movie before. And I think that's a pretty decent movie.
It's amazing.
And the studio was interfering with him here, which is why we had ended up getting with this director's cut. And once again, in the director's cut, it helps him as much as it hurts him. We don't need a whole scene at the beginning of the movie where we hear Boone's girlfriend sing an entire song in this Calgary club, right? We don't need it to go on for as long as it does.
I think I kind of like that scene. I don't know.
It just goes on.
Remind me of David Lynch.
Yeah. They did a similar thing in the director's cut of Dark City, by the way, where there's a scene where Jennifer Connelly sings this entire
similar
song.
Type of thing.
And it's like, well, yeah, she's a singer in a bar. Do we need to hear this entire song? No, we don't. That's indulgent of the director's cut. Mm-hmm. But what I like about having this director's cut is that we get more of the Nightbreed world, more of the creatures, more of the weird rules. One of the characters who first meets Boone, one of the first Nightbreeds he meets, confuses Boone for someone else and says, "Oh, I understand. I have to show you my true face," and then proceeds to scalp himself in front of Boone as he is horrified. And at the time you're watching that scene, when you don't know the context of it, it just seems like this random crazy moment. But there is a place in northern Alberta called Midian where the monsters go. And if you're a monster and you want to be accepted somewhere, you find Midian and you will be there. Boone, Craig Schaefer, is convinced by his evil psychiatrist that he is a murderer. And he decides he is a monster and must therefore seek out Midian. The psychiatrist follows in tow both to frame Boone for his crimes and to seek out this place Midian. Because if there's any place that he could belong or he could rule, maybe it would be that as well. Mm-hmm. In execution, it's wonky, but I like the story.
Yeah.
That's sort of where I start with Nightbreed.
I feel like, and I'm going to mention some positives in a moment. I think one of the things we've discovered over time is that Stephen King should not be directing movies.
Well,
right?
He did direct
He's a huge
Overdrive.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And occasionally he can write a screenplay if you have the right director to shape it. Pet Sematary is the best example of that. But this is one where I think reading the story is a lot more interesting than seeing this movie. And it may have been the limitations of what they could do at that time. And so, I mean, a lot of the looks for the characters, it looks like masks and kind of bad makeup, and maybe I've been spoiled by movies and TV shows in that genre that have a lot, the technology now to make it look better. I wonder if, again, I've said many times I don't like remakes, but maybe it would be the time for a remake, and it would perhaps, depending on how it was handled, be better than this. All right. I said I was going to say nice things. I love the fact that there is a major motion picture that's set in Calgary.
Yes.
Yeah,
unabashedly. They don't hide it.
No, they don't hide anything. They're in Calgary. They have, arguably the most famous Canadian director. I mean, there's a few others that could claim that, but I think Cronenberg is the man, and certainly in 1990 he was the man and a horror legend. So having him act in your horror movie, I mean, as bad as he is, and he's awful.
Yeah.
He is awful, and that was a big problem I had early on, and I had trouble throughout. If David Cronenberg is willing to be in my horror movie, I'm going to do it. I mean, so I don't blame anybody for this. And you said you have a personal connection because you know geographically where
they were shooting it.
And that was part of the fun for me because my brother and sister and lots of my relatives now live in Calgary, so I've spent more time the last few years there. And I was trying to figure out where Midian actually is, and I kind of thought it was heading towards Canmore, but I could be completely wrong about that.
They do give vague directions in the movie, like north of Peace River and south of some other place.
Yeah. Because I don't think it was actually anywhere close to where I was thinking it was. Right. But I mean, I think the Calgary stuff is in Calgary.
Absolutely.
So that was interesting to me. Just more, I've liked some movies because the movie Elf I maybe like a little bit more, and it actually has become a Christmas classic. But I saw that being filmed when I was living in New York, and I saw it. At first, I thought this looks like it's going to be a disaster. James Caan is in a Santa outfit,
right?
But then a year later, it comes out and become Yeah. So I kind of have a soft spot for some of these movies where I can have that kind of personal connection.
It's weird insider baseball stuff.
It is, but at the same time, I just could not get into this film. I didn't find it scary. I found it distracting. I don't know why I was bored by it, because it's such an ambitious idea, but I got bored by, and I don't say that lightly, because everybody, if the movie's over 15 minutes now, it seems like people say, oh, well, that's so boring. But it was just, I was not invested in the story at all. And I really wanted to be. And I wanted to sort of think outside of perhaps my Nero serial killer David Lynch box, which is quite a different type of box. But and embrace a movie like this. But I just could not do it. And so after that, I tracked down Lord of Illusions to see if is my issue totally with Clive Barker as a filmmaker, as opposed to being a novelist, because I really like Candyman, for example, but he didn't direct Candyman, and I think Candyman's better than any of these.
Oh, yeah.
But Lord of Illusions, I could get behind that story a little bit more. Now, the subject matter, I guess, is totally different. One has kind of this magician cultish type of thing. So I thought it was a more fair comparison to compare these two, and I was just a lot more engaged with Lord of Illusions as opposed to this film. So I don't know why I couldn't get into this world, because I feel like it is an interesting world, and maybe you're right. Like now, if one of these cable networks was to take it and turn it into a TV show.
I think the size of it was part of the problem. Part of it is that he's more of a writer than a filmmaker. I will concede that, absolutely. Yeah. But again, I think this idea of the place where the monsters live and hide, and they accept that they're monsters and they accept each other, but beyond that they don't want to fuck with the human world at all. In fact, Boone kind of spoils the whole thing for them.
He does,
The humans come to destroy the monsters, which would seem like the right thing to do. You got this entire community of monsters living outside of your town. But the thing is, they weren't fucking with anybody. They were just trying to be outsiders and be by themselves. So even though, when the rednecks show up to kill the monsters, they're not entirely wrong in what they're doing. You're sympathetic to the creatures too, at least some of them. I was. I will defend some of the creature designs. I know that they are overtly monster-y. There's the one guy who has the strange moon-shaped head.
Yeah,
that sort of almost feels Garbage Pail Kidsy.
That's part of the problem for me.
But there are other ones that I think looked really cool. That guy with the weird spindly dreadlock-looking things, or that porcupine chick. I think she looked kind of cool. But then there were other ones when Boone's going down the passages that just looked like they threw some mud on people's faces. And they're just really quick.
They mustn't have had much of a budget for the movie.
And I think Bartholomew, this big creature that they had in there, I don't think that was rendered. I don't know if it was a special effects thing, but this big oracle creature thing that they're supposed to worship doesn't look that credible at any point in the movie, and I think that's kind of important. It's sort of their tree of life, so when it's destroyed, we should feel something, and I didn't.
Okay, yeah, no, I didn't. All right.
But again, weird moments that seem strong. There's a scene of a family getting killed in Calgary at the very beginning of the movie by the David Cronenberg character.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing it. It was 1990 when it came out, so I was quite young. Yeah. I remember thinking that was just straight up fucking disturbing the first time I saw it.
I could see that, yeah. Being younger, the character. And I don't know if you would be criticizing his acting as much at that time. You would just be getting the...
He hits this woman across the face twice with this straight razor, and we see the wound, and we see her fall and try to call out, but be unable to. And there's something just awful about it. And again, I guess, going back to 1990, so I would be like, it's basically about 14 years old. Okay, yeah. This movie set in Calgary. Those could be our neighbors. There's some reason that made it personal to me.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think at the beginning of the podcast, I really like that this was set in my backyard. Not because it was made by somebody in my backyard, but because that was a conscious choice of the story. They decided the best way to set Cabal, which is what the novel's called, the best place to set it was Alberta, and they stuck to their guns. And again, that's what happens when the author is directly involved. You get the feeling like if anyone else was directing it, this wouldn't be shot in Alberta. It's going to be shot in Calgary. It doesn't matter where it's shot, okay? There's a city where some of the action takes place, and there's a town where some of the monster action takes place. Fuck the rest of it, right? And that's the benefit of having the writer and the director being the same person. The bad thing is that he wants to keep everything in there, and he's basing it off of a novel, and it's just too big to put everything in there. You have to make hard cuts when you adapt a novel to a movie, and his unwillingness to do that made it sprawl, and the more it became closer to 2 hours than 90 minutes, the more it was unwieldy. Again, I understand that there are huge problems with the movies, but I do have a lot of affection for it, and I do think there are certain movies that you're willing to play D for. I keep on picking on Lynch, but Lost Highway first. Like, would you say that was a flawless movie?
For what I like in a movie, it's not perfect, but it's...
You like it almost for its flaws as well as for what works, right? And I mean, obviously...
The questions I have and still have about it, I like, but...
The imagination is rich enough for me to acknowledge but look past these flaws. And I realize that a lot of people won't. But if you're into the horror movies for A, the teeth and the tissue, and B, the imagination, I think there's a lot of that in Nightbreed. As far as technical filmmaking and as far as acting, pretty wonky.
Yeah.
But there's enough good in it that I encourage you to give it a try.
I think this might be my Achilles heel as far as sometimes watching horror movies, and I again trying to evolve a little bit and being a bit more open-minded than when I was younger, but I just couldn't get behind this thing, and so this is when I was looking forward to talking to you about, because I wanted to get your take on it,
right?
Because I thought that because this one was your selection, and
well, I wanted to look at director's cuts, generally speaking.
Yeah. And so a lot of the things that you're saying are,
all of the flaws that are in the theatrical cut are also in the director's cut. It's just more.
And I've only seen the director's cut. I haven't seen the theatrical cut.
And again, it'd be more streamlined. There's be a little bit less. The big difference is his buddy in the director's cut, the guy who was half scalped. Is actually killed towards the end of the movie in the director's cut. In the theatrical version, he gets to live and is with them at the end of the movie. But other than that, basically everything plays out as you've seen it. There's just more. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I sound like I'm somebody who likes shorter movies, and I'm easily bored with this. For some reason, it bored me, and it just seemed like the climax was endless.
Right.
And I don't know where there's some sort of a bias in there in myself, where I might accept this type of film from Sam Raimi,
right?
And because if we look at Evil Dead's and Army of Darkness, not everything in there is technically well made, but it was just so entertaining and so interesting and over the top, like this is. And with a lot of imagination, but for some reason I'm able to accept that with him.
And Army of Darkness was fun. This is almost high-minded. I won't say pretentious because it's a little bit too goofy to go all the way out to pretentious, but the whole who is the real monster thing is pretty unsubtle. And again, I imagine what this movie would be like if they hired an actor to play that villain instead of Cronenberg. Because his delivery is just so flat. It's dispassionate, and it doesn't come off as him being crazy. It comes off as him being almost bored, and it's unfortunate.
You're human. Your antagonist needs to be, and there's real opportunities in a horror movie. You can, and in this you can be over the top, and you can be, and so that was a design I did like with that.
The button
mask thing is really, you're right. It is. That's where I thought, okay, that this is just the first act. All right, things are really going to start happening now. But it just didn't. Didn't get there for me.
Whereas for me, I was like, stop talking and put that mask back on.
Yes. Could we make the character mute?
Exactly.
Just wearing the mask and going around.
I think, you'll know from this conversation whether or not Nightbreed is to your taste. Definitely, it's not over-reliant on CGI. This is the meaty,
which is
spongy special effects. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think, like I say, the cast is wonky, but it's almost made up for by the imagination. I might have overpraised it by including it on, I think it was like 23rd on my list or whatever like that. But it's always a movie that I've had a soft spot for. And again, I would very much welcome somebody taking another serious whack at it again.
Yeah, and you have this connection to it because of where you grew up, right? So, which is, there's something to be said for that subjective thing.
And for a while there was Nightbreed comic books and Nightbreed spin-off novels and stuff like that, and I kind of got into the world. And, then the next thing came along.
And I'm biased because I'm the illegitimate son of David Lynch.
Right. Good enough.
Okay, so 20?
Yeah.
All right, I think you're going to hate this one.
Uh-oh.
Based on some earlier comments and other conversations we've had. But for me, number 20 is Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, directed by David Lynch. David Lynch films throws a lot at you, and Twin Peaks in particular, the TV show, the new TV show, and this movie that's really a prequel to the TV show. But there's some really horrifying images in there and what's happening. And I think it really does have, as I try to, the more I watch these films and try to understand them, which is a really, really difficult thing. And Lynch will never reveal what his movies are completely about because he really forces his audience to think. There is a bit of a religious struggle in there. And I saw this with some of the movies I was considering for this list that Lynch did. There seems to be a demon character at the center of this, and that demon character has this
Bob.
Yeah, Bob. But it has this effect on this entire town, and it was the most 1950s-esque small town you could come up with in Washington. I think the whole Twin Peaks idea is a great location to set. To set anything, and so I'm a huge fan of Twin Peaks. I've heard some people that really hate this. They love the show, but they hate Fire Walk with Me. Watching it a few times over, I keep returning to it, and I feel like I don't know if it's because of the limited series that it's getting more attention. I couldn't find it for the longest time. I remember it coming out in theaters, and I wanted a copy of it, and I couldn't find a copy of Fire Walk with Me.
I have it on glorious VHS, and I have a difficult relationship with Lynch generally. I liked the first season of Twin Peaks. I hated the second season of Twin Peaks. And this new series, I made it about 3 episodes in, and then I just threw my hands in the
you need
air.
to keep going with it.
The thing is, like, for me, and again, I'm clearly in the minority on this, is like, it's okay to be oblique. It's okay to, leave the audience guessing. But to me, I have to believe that you have a master plan. And I've watched enough David Lynch that I kind of feel like sometimes he doesn't have a master plan. He's just being David Lynch. And I find that a harder thing to respect. I think that he has moments of brilliance, but I also think a stopped clock is right twice a day. So
the thing I will defend about the second season, I think he should not have been working in the studio system. Which network was it? ABC, because they wanted, they were trying to force him to do some things that he didn't want to do with Twin Peaks. And I think the second season, it's either they were forcing some of this stuff, or he was like, screw it, they're going to cancel me anyway, so I'm just going to give them a giant middle finger here.
First season was
First
weird.
season's brilliant.
It was weird, but there was some sort of like almost subconscious through line to it. And the second season is nonsense. I mean, one man talking, but it comes off to me as nonsense.
But I feel like some of it gets cleared up in the limited series, and maybe a little bit with this movie. So
I will see your polarizing choice of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me and raise you with an arguably more polarizing choice of Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow.
Oh, I was considering it. I was actually considering it. So
here's the thing: as an adaptation of the story, it's a complete failure. As an over-the-top tribute to the Hammer Horror Studios, it's kind of ingenious.
Yes.
You got all these classic British actors, getting decapitated and their heads spinning, and this crazy over-the-top. And if you love you some like Christopher Walken, Christopher Walken's entire presence in this movie is just rah, rah, rah. And it's completely stupid. Christina Ricci and Johnny Depp do not feel period at all. There's some lines that are really loud groaning, and yet it seems all completely appropriate. There's a scene during a romantic exchange between Christina Ricci and Johnny Depp where they cut to this bird in the tree, and it's the fakest looking bird you've ever seen. It's like, it's also perfect.
Yeah.
And there's some, like, when I first watched this movie, I was kind of like, what the fuck, Tim Burton? And
me too.
Every time I watch it, I like it a little bit more, and it's fought its way to 20th place. It even surprises me. There's a lot, especially in this bottom part of the list, that are just, they're entertaining movies, I guess, more than genuinely great movies, but I am entertained every time I watch Sleepy Hollow.
Well, and I think Burton and Lynch are filmmakers that have a very unique stamp on all their films. You can tell it's a Lynch film, you can tell it's a Burton film, but some people really hate them as filmmakers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Sleepy Hollow I didn't like the first time I saw it, but I like the cast. And there's some other like weird things, like I fairly famous episode of Inside the Actors Studio where Johnny Depp explained how he decided to play Ichabod Crane, and he wanted to create he wanted to meld Angela Lansbury's character from Murder, She Wrote and a 12-year-old girl into one. And then he said this was a really expensive movie they were making, and he was playing the lead role as a pre-adolescent girl. So, but it works. The whole thing works, and it's a very good-looking film too.
Yeah. Nope, that's why I put it in 20th place. Number 19.
Number 19 for me is a big movie, and I think you could still call it a horror movie. Some people might roll their eyes at this one just because of what he's done since, but The Sixth Sense is... I still go back to the very first time I saw it, and there were some jumps in there. 99, I think, was a better year for film in general, but there were some decent horror movies that year. And kind of back before M. Night Shyamalan started to think he could do anything he wants, this was probably his most, this and perhaps Signs are his most centered films. And it was a genuine surprise, which I don't think you can release a movie anymore with a genuine surprise or plot twist, because they'll be ruined in 5 seconds by social media. Yeah. So I'm glad that I had a few years in there where I could see this movie and experience it.
I have the feeling like we're stuck with Shyamalan. He will continue to make decent or horrible movies for years to come.
The last one wasn't Bad Split.
No matter how good or bad a movie he ever makes, he will always have The Sixth Sense.
Yeah, so, yeah, for sure.
In 19th place for me, and I wanted to represent remakes, and I also wanted to talk about how in the early 90s, they were really being tough on violence. Tom Savini directed this remake of Night of the Living Dead. The screenplay was done by George Romero, and the studio cut all of the violence out of the movie. Pretty much all of the violence out of the movie. And incredibly, the movie still works. Yeah. I think it's an interesting retake on the story in that he takes Barbara, a character who was basically hysterical and catatonic in his original movie, and makes her sort of the strongest character in the remake.
Yes.
And if you're familiar with the original, he sort of remixes it enough so that he plays with your expectation a little bit. I'm talking about Romero, the screenwriter. And I don't think that Savini sucks necessarily as a director. I think, he's a special effects makeup guy, and he had all of the special effects cut out of the movie. So, like, my heart goes out to him. I think it's a decent remake. The other remake that I'm not including here, I think it's a little bit bombastic and over the top, but I also think it would be weird not to at least mention it. Martin Scorsese's take on Cape Fear with Robert De Niro. It's crazy operatic and big in scale, and it's almost too much at times, but I had to at least give it a mention. But in 19th place for me, Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead was very, very close for me. It's one of these ones on the list, and then when I had to take it off, I felt really bad about it. And the other thing I wanted to mention is Tony Todd's performance was amazing. This guy is a true horror movie actor. Like when he's in a movie, whether he's on kind of the good side as he is, or he's Candyman, which is not so nice. He's got a great presence on screen. And as far as Cape Fear, keep listening to my list. I shall. Jason Dubray, what was your 18th ranked movie from the 1990s?
This one might be polarizing. I don't know. I don't. You know, like you're worried about Lee. We see both very. Lee has a lot of power over the show, I guess. But I wasn't sure how you react to this one. But 18th for me is Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It is style galore. Some of the performances are not the best, but I really liked Gary Oldman. This was in this phase where he was so good, it took me years to realize he was actually British. Right. And he's fabulous in this. And Winona Ryder, I actually think she was batting 1,000 at that time. You know, coming on. But I think Age of Innocence was after that, and then Little Women. Plus, then she had the Heathers thing, and like she had a good 80s run. into the 90s, and I'm glad to see her again on Stranger Things. But I really like this particular. I'm not sure if it's probably fair to say it's a Hollywood version of Dracula, but Coppola is so independent, and I know that he was on top of everything. It was totally his vision, and I liked it from the beginning. It exceeded my expectations, and for years it's a movie that's just I've always enjoyed. So
it's not on my list, and here's the thing: like, I don't feel like I need to defend it not being on my list particularly. I think anybody who's seen the movie would understand what's to like and not like about the movie. There is a lot to like about the movie, but there's also large problems, and there's also just this thing. And generally, as a tactic of a movie, I don't like it. I feel this is one of those movies that's just screaming at you the whole time. It's just nose to nose, yelling into your face, and it's exhausting.
Here's where I decided that it didn't qualify, but I was really, really tempted to put Natural Born Killers on here as well. I think I like movies that scream at me.
Right.
You know, it's just I do like overly stylized films sometimes. As I get older, I think I'm moving away from that a little bit more, but definitely in the 90s, I would go for that kind of thing.
There's stuff I like about it. I also think that people make fun of Keanu Reeves, and this movie
is a small part of the film.
It's a small part of the film, but he is terrible in the movie.
He's terrible in a lot of movies.
It's not just the bad accent. The accent is bad. The performance is bad. I think this was the year he did this and Much Ado About Nothing, and it was like amazing.
That was 93. Yeah, it was within a few months, within half a year.
It's amazing to me that his career actually recovered from it, because those two back to back, ouch. But fair enough.
Our God, our Lord and Savior Lee Beckman said to me years ago that he was one of the most well-read actors.
Right.
He's not much of an actor, but he was well-read, so he knew how to choose the best scripts for the limited things that he could do. He's kind of found, kind of a new stage of his career, which I didn't think would ever happen.
Right.
After like several things that others cannot get away with, he's managed to get away with. And I actually hear he's a nice guy.
Well,
so
that's
nice guy. That's fine. I would agree with you about his section of the film.
Yeah.
But Oldman was so good. And he had to play all these different versions of Dracula, which at the time I hadn't seen. I
appreciate the effects are all in camera too. It looks like it's digitally been fucked with, but 90% of what you see shot on camera. There's a lot of stuff to respect.
I also, there's something about the score for that movie. It was very operatic, and for years I have not been able to get that score out of my head. And
you'll hear it in trailers and stuff like that, and right away go, oh, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
And like Sleepy Hollow, great costumes, great art direction, everything. It's a good-looking film.
So for me, 18, here's another weird one. I feel like every one I put on this list, here's a weird
Here's
selection.
a weird one.
It's about bugs that grow to be human size and can take the shape of humans that live beneath New York. It's completely ludicrous, and it's got this sort of icky, creepy, crawly thing. I think the magic ingredient here was Guillermo del Toro. If you can get past the early 90s CGI special effects, which there are a couple of sequences which kind of stings a little bit, this movie way overperforms for me. Like, for this premise of bugs that can take the shape of humans, it's way better than it has any business being. And it has a few moments, and we'll talk about it when we review it, for me, of genuine surprise. And when I sat down to watch this movie Mimic, I was not expecting that. So, I'm a Guillermo del Toro fanboy. Here sits Mimic.
Yeah, and I mean, when we talk about it, I hadn't actually seen it until watching it for this show. Wow. And I've always wanted to, and I was like, great. I mean, I've heard such great things. Guarantee this is going to be on my list. And I saw it, and I was like, I don't know.
Well, we'll talk about it.
It's not bad, but it just wasn't quite there for me. Right. And I feel like it should have. And maybe I just haven't given it enough time. Right. Maybe a second or third viewing would give me a different perspective on it, but... Yeah, well, I get it, and it's a horror movie. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
You're not going to be criticized for that one.
I think your little Frankenstein's got the better of you.
They all died in the lab.
But you let them out. Evolution is a way of keeping things alive.
Sometimes an insect will evolve to mimic its predator. A fly can look like a spider. A caterpillar can look like a snake. They are breeding.
Whatever it becomes, it destroys.
Peter, these are lungs.
Yesterday, it became human.
If that thing has been around, how come nobody's ever seen it?
I think we have.
You see the size of that thing?
We changed its DNA.
Mira Sorvino, Jeremy Northam, Josh Brolin, Charles Dutton, Giancarlo Giannini, F. Murray Abraham. Mimic.
So when we were talking about Nightbreed, I was sort of talking about a movie that obviously had some stuff working against it, some things that it had to climb over in order to get into it. Mimic's in a similar category, although right out of the gate it kind of overperformed for me. Mira Sorvino is an actress is a scientist, an actress playing a scientist, yes. Who had created this special strain of insect that was going to kill all the other bugs that were carrying this hostile virus, which was causing a lot of kids to get sick. And yay, success! She puts new bugs into the New York sewer system. The good bugs kill the bad bugs, and the kids are cured. Credits, movie over. No, actually, 10 years later, they're finding some weird insects in the sewer system, and large swaths of the homeless population of New York seems to be going missing. And she's called in to do some investigating, and these bugs that were supposed to sort of do their job and cease to exist have, in Jurassic Park sense, life has found a way. Yeah. And not only have they grown bigger and buggier, they have started to affect this mimic thing, where the way they fold their wings over themselves, they almost look like some guy hunched over in a trench coat, yes, standing by the subway. Like, at first glance, they almost pass for people, but they're not people. So, I mean, I'm a horror movie fan. I'm in for a killer bug movie, whatever. And that's the attitude I take going into seeing Mimic. Oh, it's a killer bug movie, whatever. And although it is a killer bug movie and whatever, it is way better than it has any business being, in my opinion. It's got a way better cast, it's got way better production values, and aside for some pretty shaky CGI, and in its defense, it was still in the
late 90s,
stumbling era of figuring out what you can and can't get away with on CGI. I think it was pretty strong. And there were two scenes in the movie that genuinely surprised me. There's a scene where Mira Sorvino has made friends with these two precocious little kids who find bugs for her.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they go down into the sewers and they find this big egg sack. And I'm expecting, oh, here's going to be a pop scare where the kids see a big bug. Nope, they're both fucking killed.
Yeah.
Boom.
Mm-hmm.
I was not expecting that. Like, or even if one of them got caught and the other one ran out to tell the others what happened. Nope, those two kids are dead. Dead off of the board. Same thing with Josh Brolin. I know he's a bigger star now than he was in the time that Mimic was made, but I expected his character to have a bigger role to play in the movie than he ended up doing. And sometimes they kill a strong character early in the movie and you're like, oh, that's disappointing. I wish they were going to do more with that. But I was so genuinely surprised. Even when the movie uses tropes, there's an autistic kid who
that scene
bangs
bothered
his spoons together.
That bothered me.
I don't like them using that angle. I mean, it's obviously something personal to me that like I just think using this sort of affectation is like a superpower or a way. He is, quote, a dumb kid, but he's smart enough to know the difference between the way a human walks and the way a mimic walks. That's mixed for me. But again, I'm surprised. He's got this father figure from Kronos, actually, this Italian actor from Kronos, who's sort of been looking after him. And he goes to play protection for the little boy.
Yeah.
He gets fucking... Like, there's a cruelty to this movie. It has no problem killing off characters that you like, and I think it does it for a monster jumping out of the dark genre movie, which it is for that genre. I think it way overperforms, and I think that has everything to do with Guillermo del Toro. So that's where I start with Mimic. Yeah,
it's interesting with Del Toro because he will often take the side of the monster.
Not this time.
Not this one. He does not. I guess maybe that's putting my own whatever on this. Is that I kept waiting for that to happen, but it doesn't happen, and maybe that's better for it as a horror movie. I mean, I was looking at because I didn't see it in theaters, and I really wanted to see it, and I don't know why it didn't happen. And then years pass by and I don't see it. And then I watched it for this, fully expecting that, everything I've heard about it's my type of horror movie. It's going to be definitely on my list of 25. And it's not that I don't like it, but it's not that I like it.
Right.
I did not expect a Guillermo del Toro film to be so in between for me. To me, it'd be one way or the other. I mean, I like...
The difference might have been when you saw it, too. In 1997 or whenever this was, Guillermo wasn't quite Guillermo yet.
Yeah.
Right? And this looked like another monster movie. Mira Sorvino was hot off of her Oscar nomination,
And that's why I wanted to see it, because Mira Sorvino, I've talked about a few... in different parts of this podcast, some actors that when I see that they're in a movie, I'm excited, even if it's, going to be, maybe not it's not going to be Mighty Aphrodite that I'm going to see. Mira Sorvino is one of those people. I mentioned Jennifer Jason Leigh, and Juliette Lewis. I mean, I people that I don't feel get a lot of work. We now know kind of why Mira Sorvino didn't get a lot of work into the 21st century, which is completely wrong. And I hope somebody will now consider putting her back in films and considering who her father is. Yeah. She should have, that just shows how anybody could have been a victim of Harvey Weinstein and this system, which has been around much longer than Harvey Weinstein.
And make no mistake,
she's a terrific actor.
Weinstein is not an isolated...
No, it is not.
I guarantee you there are several Harvey Weinsteins out there that aren't.
If you hear about the history of Judy Garland's career,
there you go.
I mean, that's... And there'd be all of these unnamed female actors who could have been Judy Garland, could have been...
but I guess that's
Betty
a
Davis.
stain put on the movie through the benefit of time. Again, imagine it was 1997 and you were sitting down to watch Mimic, right? And you didn't know what you do about Weinstein, and you hadn't seen where Guillermo's career was going to go.
Yeah, I remember hearing about this movie coming out. I was excited to see it, and I just didn't end up seeing it. And maybe I put some expectations on this that I shouldn't have. And so I think it's fine. I like a lot of the setup. I think the setup is why it becomes something a little bit more elevated than a B movie.
Right.
And there have been, again, so many movies about human beings interfering in things that they should not interfere with. So none of that was surprising to me, though. It just kind of falls apart in the third act. I mean, we're stuck in like the bowels of the New York City subway system with these characters. And I thought he's going to do something interesting here, and it becomes like just another
Explode the Hive.
Action-y Hollywood type of film versus the films that are, I guess I like Guillermo del Toro's Spanish language films more than his English language films, and but even with Shape of Water, which I'm more critical of than some other people, I still felt his heart in that film.
Yeah.
I didn't see his heart in this film.
Well, he
as
didn't
much.
write this one either, right?
I was looking. There's several writers, so this must have been one of the things like for hire type of.
They wanted the same thing with Blade 2. They wanted somebody who could handle a budget and give us good visuals. And at the time, that's what he was thought of, instead of someone who could bring us Pan's Labyrinth or The Devil's Backbone, right, which are just amazing movies.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
I would say Blade 2 is my favorite of the Blade movies, but I'd still have a hard time calling it a good movie. I just think that Guillermo brought some real style to the action sequences, so it was more likable than the other ones. But this is much better than Blade 2, I think, in a lot of ways. And I guess if I'm watching a movie about bugs underneath the New York City, I guess I'm expecting at some point they're going to try to fight their way to the center of the hive and explode it, right? But I wasn't expecting to be chewing my nails while that happened,
Were you?
I think it really was those early kills of the two kids and the Josh Brolin character where I was like, okay, the gloves are off in this movie. Like, they have no problem killing people. So,
and Del Toro, I don't know if he had some influence in that or not.
Right. It's hard to say.
With the writing, but that's something he does, which I admire about the films that he's made that I really, really like.
Even for things that, like, deaths that we see coming. Charles S. Dutton as the black security guard.
Of course.
You're not living through this movie.
No.
But,
Remind me of...
He boldly sacrifices himself because he's bleeding badly and the bugs are attracted to it, to buy the rest of the group some time. And that kind of sucks. It's like, oh, that sucks. I like your character. And now
I felt like this is the same performance I've seen him give several times over. Though
Charles S. Dutton
Aliens 3 or whatever.
Charles S. Dutton's a really powerful actor who's
a great actor.
Rarely asked to do anything more than just show up. But, what that character's going to do. And again, like... I knew when you met that guy, he's going to lead them to the place where they meet the bugs, and then because he knows his way around the system, he's necessarily going to have to die, so they don't know how to find their way out, right? I knew that as soon as I saw him, but I still gave a shit when he died. And I think that's the difference. Or just the grossness of it. There's this scene where they're squishing all the bug guts on themselves so that the bugs won't see them.
Yeah.
And that was really gross.
Really gross, but that part's effective too. I mean, to me, this would be a 3-star movie. But that's maybe my disappointment with it, is that it isn't like, I absolutely hated this, but I admire the ambition.
Right.
Or this is one of the greatest horror movies I've ever seen, and maybe it's unfair to have that kind of expectation for this film.
Well, and
I was so in between, and
again, he gives us the monsters well, he gives us the kills and those scary moments as good as anyone will. The problem falls down to it being a familiar screenplay, and for a couple of missed opportunities. If you wanted to go from a Frankenstein angle, she created these bugs, and she did it for good reasons, altruistic reasons, but they are her responsibility. It's by, inference, all of these deaths are kind of on her.
But there's no consequence for her.
But that doesn't come on her face. She doesn't seem to be feeling it. No. She's doing everything she can to kill the bugs, but I don't feel her suffering over what she's done. I don't see her torment. There's no flaw or heroic element to her character. She's just sort of dealing with the information as she gets it. And I think that was a missed opportunity. The other thing, and they tried to touch on it with the director's cut, but it was footage that was unshot. But the original idea was that the bugs were not only increasing in size and evolving quicker than they anticipated, not just in their appearance, but in their mentality. Originally, at the end of the movie, instead of this big, explosive kill the mother bug sequence, basically the bugs claim the New York underground. They confront Mira Sorvino and all of a sudden speak to her and say, the underground is ours now. And basically say, stay out of the underway. The subway systems, the sewer systems, they belong to us now. And that's where the movie was going to end.
That's where that movie that you're describing would be up there.
Right. Instead, we get the conventional, crush the mother bug, no more eggs come, explode the hive. I will argue that it's very well executed, kill the mother bug and explode the hive, but I will agree. I think that it would be stronger and creepier if humans lose, bugs win, right? And I think that makes a certain amount of sense.
I would say the first 2 acts of the movie are terrific.
Right.
But it just felt like it was building up to something a lot more interesting than what the payoff wasn't there for me. And then like the end scene with their felt so Hollywood, the couple, and
it was Guillermo del Toro doing a for-pay job, but I think doing
he didn't have enough power to object to.
But he made a pretty decent monster movie. And there's not enough.
It's not the worst.
Yeah,
it's
especially
not the worst,
in the '90s. Again, like list all the great monster movies from the '90s.
Well, David Lynch didn't make a monster movie in there, but if so, it would have been great.
And there's Deep Rising. Like, what are the '90s monster movies?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So I remain a fan of Guillermo. I remain a fan of Mimic. If it sounds like something that will appeal to you, it will. Yeah, it gets kind of conventional, but for a conventional horror movie, it's executed well. Also, a crazy cast. F. Murray Abraham for a couple scenes. Norman Reedus in there for a couple scenes. It's star-studded. Check out Mimic if you haven't.
Yeah, it's worth the view. Okay, we're on to 17 and this is one of the ones that we are going to review, The Exorcist Part 3. And I might repeat this later on, but The Exorcist is my favorite horror movie of all time.
Right.
And so for sequels to exist, but I mean, I've lived with them my entire, cinematic life, as it were. I just knew that they didn't just leave The Exorcist as The Exorcist. I think they did a great job of this particular sequel, bringing elements from the original, making some things make sense, and then finding a different level of horror, because what you could get away with in 1990 was different than the early 70s, even though they really did push the limits in the early 70s. It's a very, maybe it's a little bit of a flaw, and maybe that's why it's not, a little bit higher on my list, is that it is fairly intellectual in places.
Right.
And they do want to analyze this, and I think that was William Peter Blatty was so concerned about the Catholicism and the theology connected to an actual exorcism. So there's some sections that might drag for modern audiences, but again, I really enjoyed it. And
for me, Exorcist 3, where you're not going to make an adequate sequel to The Exorcist because you can't.
It can't.
But what it does do is make me forgive them for Exorcist 2, which in and of itself is quite the feat. because I thought that the series was so thoroughly, utterly dead after Heretic, right? That like, how could you pull out of that, right? So
a lot of this is about how you experience it, because I had heard all of these horrible things about Heretic. When I saw it, it certainly, to me, it didn't ruin The Exorcist, but I didn't hate it as much as everybody else did. Yet the third act is a giant mess.
I think that movie's a fucking garbage fire. I really do.
The problem is I like some of the actors in there, and they were able to keep me going.
So for my 17th, I have a tie, and it's sort of centered around this director, Robert Rodriguez.
Oh yeah.
I think the unsurprising one would be From Dusk Till Dawn. It's a fairly memorable and crazy vampire movie, but the one that people miss always is The Faculty.
Yeah.
It's Kevin Williamson sort of riffing on sci-fi and the invasion of the body snatchers in the same way he was riffing on When a Stranger Calls or Friday the 13th with Scream. It's not that what they're doing is completely, innovative or inventive, but they do it with enough style and enough energy as to find it quite entertaining. You're going to see a young Jon Stewart get stabbed in the eye.
Yeah,
you're going to see B.B. Newworth get stabbed through the hand with a pencil. You're going to see, all sorts of interesting stuff when you sit down to watch Famke Johansson as a super smoking hot teacher, and this weird tension between her and one of the students. So I don't know. It's that one that kind of gets forgotten about, The Faculty. I find, and I've always had a soft spot for it. And yeah, as far as From Dusk Till Dawn, I find that it's a difficult movie to hate. I mean,
it's so much fun.
It's not for everybody. I get that, but I mean, if you don't like From Dusk Till Dawn, you don't like fun.
Yeah, I guess so. I think From Dusk Till Dawn is one of my regrets that I don't have it on this list. And it's another one where...
It's maybe more funny than scary. I guess the case could be made.
Yeah, it's another one where it's wrestling, but I mean, it is... At least the second half is horror. Like, that was the criticism when it first came out, is the first part looks like it was written by Quentin Tarantino, and the second part looks like it was Robert Rodriguez. It kind of shifts, and I mean, their styles work mostly well together, but it is a lot of fun, and so don't think that my exclusion of it in the top 25 means that I don't love it, because I do, and it's one of these ones where I wanted to put it on, but I just was looking at the other movies that I had here, and I just couldn't find a spot for it and sometimes I was kind of balance out some of the smaller films you've heard, and some Canadian films, and I just couldn't find a spot for it, which is kind of odd for a movie that Tarantino was involved with. And I like Rodriguez. I like From Dusk Till Dawn quite a bit more than The Faculty. I found The Faculty, to me, it was so over the top, and I thought it was maybe a touch of Kevin Williamson thought he could do whatever he wants after the success of Scream. So it
doesn't always work out for him. He did this movie I'm going to be talking about soon on the podcast called Cursed.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yes,
terrible.
Yeah.
Like I'm not saying the inclusion of Kevin Williamson made it good, but I thought it was just overperformed for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's a horror. They're both horror movies.
Yeah.
And I kind of wish you could see that I'm kind of beating myself up here, and on the inside that I didn't put From Dusk Till Dawn in there. The Faculty didn't work for me, but it has entertaining qualities. But then I was waiting for like the payoff, and I didn't get the payoff I wanted, but I think you did, and that's good.
Right. Your turn.
My turn. I'm on to 16. This is one that we talked about in a previous show. I think it's an underrated horror movie called The Dark Half. George A. Romero directed it, and again, it's one of the ones where he had a little bit more money to work with because he was working with the studio, but it was such a disastrous process that he never did it again, unfortunately. But it's one where I think I had read the book, and then the movie came out in a similar time frame to when I had read the book, and so because the book was so fresh in my mind, I by all rights should have hated The Dark Half, but I loved it. I thought they got most of it right. I mean, you're not going to get everything in a Stephen King book together for a film, but I think it's one of the most solid adaptations of his work, and Timothy Hutton is absolutely terrific in it in both roles.
For me, it's all about Timothy Hutton in that movie. I love Romero too. I it's funny, it's not on my list. I'm thinking, why is that on my list? But I guess it just I looked at every movie in the horror movie that was made in the 90s, or at least considered it, and for whatever reason, Dark Half didn't make the list.
So it's kind of like you're from Dusk Till Dawn,
yes. I do think it's worthy inclusion, and I do think it has a lot to do with Timothy Hutton playing those two roles very effectively.
I feel like it gets forgotten about, and I want to sort of keep the memory of this movie alive.
Good fix. In 16th place for me, Dear Ravenous, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways.
Oh, nice. Oh, good
Guy
choice.
Pearce is centering this absolutely batshit insane movie. He through an act of cowardice manages to heroically overtake the command of the enemy, and his reward is to be sent to this obscure location in the middle of nowhere so he can be ignored, where he encounters a deliciously over-the-top Robert Carlyle, who plays a madman who has learned that if you eat somebody, you attain these magical healing properties and super strength. And although the movie is every bit as crazy as it sounds, it's also completely entertaining.
Yes.
Like, it's full of faces that you're like, what are you doing in this movie, Jeffrey Jones?
Yes.
And it's got an absolutely bonkers soundtrack to it. There's something just unforgettably mad about the movie. And you just got to roll with the punches. No matter what you see in the movie, just accept it and wait for the next scene. In some ludicrous way, the pieces do all eventually fit. But this is a bloody, crazy, funny, violent movie that more people should watch. Ravenous in 16th place.
This was my fear as I was going through this, that you would mention a movie. I was like, why did I not?
Ravenous.
Yeah, that's another great choice there. I mean, I don't know, balancing it out, if it would have actually made my top 25, but it's definitely worthy. And I mean, yeah, it's a movie that actually has some ambition to it and does things that I think you were saying a lot of 90s horror movies were not willing to.
Yeah, they were trying shit, so points for even that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Robert Carlyle,
wow,
man, that guy can go over the top. He does it so well. Yeah. He does it so well. Number 15, right?
Yeah.
Number 15 for me. Now, I don't know if it's because of the previous movies that I can get away with calling this a horror movie or not. Certainly comedic horror movie, but Army of Darkness by Sam Raimi.
Right.
And I just had one of the great experiences of going to the movies. My first year of university, I was playing at Place Real. They were having a sci-fi horror film festival, and went to see Army of Darkness. And I don't know if this is a good thing or not, and me selling this as a horror movie, but I don't remember laughing that hard in the movie. But it was so funny, yet it's gory and not quite as gory, I think, as Evil Dead. So Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, I would probably rank higher as far as being
quality
pure
movies.
Horror movies. But I think that the secret was out after Evil Dead 2 that he was actually making a comedy as well.
Yeah.
So everybody was kind of on board and was aware that this was supposed to be funny as well. So that might be a little bit of a flaw there, but I really enjoyed it. I have it in the middle of this list here. I don't think you could go wrong with this. Yet I do feel like you should see Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2 before you see Army of Darkness.
No, it's a package deal, but Army of Darkness is stupidly awesome, and yes, we'll be talking about that again later.
Yeah, sounds good. Good.
In 15th position, this is a tough one. I have a love-hate relationship with it. I had to include it on the list, but I couldn't put it too high because it makes me fucking uncomfortable. Audition.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It sort of starts really innocently. Like the first hour 15 minutes of this movie is like this old guy who is lonely, and his buddy has this great plan that they'll hold these auditions to find like the perfect girl for him. It's under the auspices that they're looking for an actress, but really he's looking for a companion. And it reminds me of like the David Mamet play Oleana taken to like a more extreme, and like his behavior towards this girl is not very good. He is kind of awful. He maybe doesn't know that he's being insensitive and awful to her, but in the end of the day, he is. But the punishment does not in any way suit the crime. So it is a hard to shake movie. So I will give it points for that. It stays with you. I'm going to shout out to my friend Anita, who's supposed to be doing a ranking review, who's had a list of movies to watch for almost 2 years now. And the thing that's hanging her up is that audition's on the list.
She doesn't want to.
She's scared to watch it. So,
but you can hate a movie on this podcast. You can
even if you don't like it. But I think like she's just the reputation has preceded it. It's a tough watch, and it is a tough watch. But it's not stupid. It's not necessarily straightly exploitive. It's just. It's ugly. So audition.
Yeah, I have to admit I haven't seen it, so I won't be able to say as much about. I have heard of it, but so it didn't make my list because of that.
Fair enough. If you haven't seen
I don't know what I happen to like David Mamet. Some people really hate David Mamet. I like David Mamet, so if it's that type of a thing, does it have a bit of a Neil LaBute quality too?
Well, in that it's taking an uncomfortable subject matter and kind of poking it and poking it and poking it. Definitely Mamet and LaBute are definitely guilty of that.
Yeah.
This is obviously like it's an Asian torture porny-ish sort of thriller. So the context of it is much different. But what I was talking about with Oleana is that, this guy does some things that are shady, that are actually maybe even kind of gross.
Yeah.
But he does not deserve
what
his
happens.
Fate.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Yes, that's where
I think I'll watch it just because it sounds so controversial that I have to see this.
Take a look for sure.
Okay, 14. Shout out to Joel Shoemaker with this one. It was early 90s. I think it is Flatliners as a offshoot of the 80s, kind of a little bit of a quasi Brat Pack type of thing, even though they aren't official members of the Brat Pack. I watched it again very, very recently just to see if the first time it freaked me out just because I was younger or whatever. But I think it's just unfortunately it's been remade. But I think it's just a great premise for a horror movie. And that comment on doctors playing God, it was, and the actors they got, I think it's the one and only time that you would have Kiefer Sutherland getting higher billing than Julia Roberts in a movie. And Kevin Bacon happens to be in this thing as well. Great cast.
Oliver Platt.
Oliver Platt, underrated actor, and he's terrific in it. And it's one of the interesting things is he's the only one who has the sense not to actually try to die to solve the mysteries of death. I liked it a lot, and I think it is very well directed by Shoemaker. He had there was a lot of symbolism in there, but it was subtle. We're dealing with bullying and guilt about all sorts of things.
Sins being manifested and being punished. And
starting to show up there, and like that, the kid that they got to be the kid that Kiefer Sutherland's character apparently killed had the look for any horror movie at that particular time, and so those scenes are because you don't know completely what's going on. You see flashes of it, and it's revealed in a very clever way, and it's like some of the setups are a little bit the lights are suddenly dark in the subway in New York City, and he's by himself. No good is going to come out of this, but I think they all sell it really well.
I love Flatliners. I didn't include it on my list. I think that it's more interesting than frightening to me, and it's also I found the same thing actually when I rewatched Jacob's Ladder for this. It really feels 90s to me in a way it didn't when I watched it the first time because it was the 90s. It hasn't aged as gracefully as I would have liked it to, but I think you're right. The premise is rock solid, and the execution ain't bad.
And Sutherland has that quality, and maybe the younger Kiefer Sutherland, before he became kind of the Jack Bauer hero or president. I haven't watched that show where he's the president of the United States type of thing. he was playing a lot of really kind of ugly characters and darker characters, but he had that arrogant quality that was perfect for the lead character in this film. And I thought Roberts was very good too.
Yeah.
And in the scenes that she had, it was kind of subtle, the guilt that she had surrounding her father. And this movie is just so fresh in my mind because I just watched it last weekend.
Right.
To figure out where it belongs, if it belongs on the list. And but for me, I maybe I wasn't bothered by it being very, very early 90s and looking early 90s as much.
That's not necessarily a problem. It's just something that I noticed.
Yeah.
Because at the time, especially Jacob's Ladder seemed like such a cutting-edge movie, and it's starting to feel...
I had a different reaction once we talked about Jacob's Ladder compared to the first time. The first time, you're like, what's going on? And Flatliners, I felt like we didn't have all the pieces, but it was...
fairly clear what was happening.
a little bit more clear than Jacob's Ladder. You have to think through the whole thing.
In 14th place, actually, speaking of Kiefer Sutherland, and one of my favorite roles of Kiefer Sutherland is in this movie. Alex Proyas's Dark City.
I was wrestling with that one. Oh.
It's again another one. It's weird to call it a horror movie, but I mean, if you're a denizen of Dark City and you've been, spoilers for Dark City if you haven't seen it, basically been pulled and put in this huge alien lab rat maze, these aliens change your environment and your identity night to night just to study you. And this whole unraveling that Rufus Sewell discovers a full year and a half before The Matrix, by the way.
Much better than The Matrix.
I really I think that the journey that character goes on, the creepiness of those villains, it feels as much a horror movie as a sci-fi movie. So that's 14th on my list, but I also wanted to give special mention to an early 90s science fiction movie called Fire in the Sky.
Oh, yes, great choice, yeah.
It's based on a, quote, true event of a bunch of hunters, I believe, who got abducted. One of them was missing for almost 3 days before they found him naked and shivering in the woods. And it's one of these real spooky ones in that there's a lot of corroborating evidence around it. And whether or not you believe the story, much like whether or not you believe the Amityville Horror, this presentation of it in the movie is quite frightening, especially in the third act when they show you what he experienced. So shout out to Fire in the Sky. Yeah. Not easy to get your hands on that one.
That's a hard one, yeah.
But in 14th place for me, Dark City. Yeah,
I like both of those. Dark City, I love that movie. It was on my top 10 list that year.
Right.
Because I'm a nerd and I make top 10 lists every year.
That's all right.
And I was struggling, much like, I don't know, From Dusk Till Dawn and a lot of the movies that you're mentioning. I was struggling with, is this a horror movie or not? I actually got to the point I Googled it and I saw this strong reply, this is not a horror movie.
Right.
I thought, okay, I guess I'll leave it out there. But it's a movie I want to promote because not a lot of people have seen it. And it did come out before The Matrix. It's a better movie than The Matrix, like several other films I was considering for this list. But then the struggle is this science fiction or is this horror or does it work for both? And so that's why I unfortunately, it's one of my regrets.
A couple sci-fi that ride the line. Like, I wasn't going to not include Alien or Invasion of the Body Snatchers in the 70s countdown, right? Like, it would just have felt wrong. So I put Communion in the 80s one, that Christopher Walken one.
Yes.
So I put a few in, but I did try to be disciplined about it. But I did find that movie frightening, honestly.
Well, the beginning of it is very scary. So so now I think From Dusk Till Dawn and maybe Dark City more than Ravenous. Right. I regret not having on this list. I'm gonna have more regrets than I am. Like, wow.
Well, do you regret your 13th choice?
I think my 13th choice is one that a lot of people will agree with if they have seen this movie, but it has not been. I don't think it's been seen by enough people. It's called Event Horizon.
Okay.
Speaking of science fiction and horror together, it has that alien type of quality. I don't think I reacted to it appropriately the first time I saw it. Watching it again and preparing for this, it is a terrifying film. It is a gory film, and it's one of these ones I don't know why people keep going on these special missions in space to these areas where there's some strange disturbance happening. Sam Neill is the lead in it, and it's a great cast. To remember the name, Kathleen Quinn
Quinlan, yeah.
Quinlan, sorry, Kathleen Quinlan. I haven't seen her in anything for a while, but she's terrific in it. And I don't know how you feel about Event Horizon. It's
everybody likes it more than I do. I think it's got some great qualities. I think on a technical execution level, there's some really amazing special effects in it, and I like the idea of scientists sort of puncturing a hole in the universe that accesses hell.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of stuff in it conceptually that I liked, but I've never found the movie particularly frightening.
Oh, really? Okay.
And
it's gory, though.
It's gory, but that's a different thing. You know what I mean? It's atmospheric, and it sort of knocks on the door of a lot of big ideas, but in the end of the day, it's sort of like a gory movie, I guess.
I think the acting, I keep mentioning this, I guess the acting sells me on that too, and Sam Neill's performance. It's kind of how that switches. Things switch with his character, and it's like, holy crap.
He's a good guy, he's a good guy, he's a good guy, then they get there, and he is a completely not good guy.
Yeah. No, I think I understand what you're saying with this one. And as I said, a lot of these movies don't actually scare me. And I don't know if I've desensitized or what the issue is. So to me, the style points, the acting, the premise, it all seemed to work for me. I mean, I felt the influence of Alien in here. Alien's a much better film.
I think it might be the director thing with me. Is it Paul Anderson?
His name's Paul W.S. Anderson, not to be mixed up with Paul Thomas Anderson, who's
but he did
one
all
of the
the
great
Resident Evil
directors.
movies, and he did the Aliens vs. Predator movies. And I find it like true with this movie as with all of his movies, in that I think they look amazing, but they don't make me feel anything.
Okay.
That's just almost uniformly how I feel about his movies. I don't know what it is, but that's
I felt something more this time, like preparing for probably more than the first time. And I guess it was, again, the perspective, because, again, our Lord and Savior Lee Beckman, he haunts this podcast. He told me that this was the scariest movie in recent memory. So I saw it, and I was underwhelmed by it initially. So I thought I needed to consider it for this list. I wasn't sure it was going to show up, and so the second viewing was so much better. And I did find it, if there was a movie that was going to get me to the place of being scared, it was this one, probably more than some of the others. So,
again, I get it. And this is one of those movies that people are going to be pissed off that I didn't put on the list. But for me, that was always the one that looked good, but that was it.
Well, fair enough.
Some reason. I have weird choices on my lists. Case in point, I've got A Zombie Tie in 13th place. The 90s were not a good time for zombies.
No.
The early aughts brought zombies back into the fort. So both of these movies are deeply strange fucking sideshow circus, like completely crazy zombie movies. We have Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, and we have Della Morte Dell'Amore, or it is known on this side of the ocean, Cemetery Man, starring Rupert Everett.
No, I thought that was 80s.
I believe that's 91. I can confirm that here.
Yeah, you're probably right.
But both of those movies completely crazy, and both of them like not what you would call traditional zombie movies. But I have a real soft spot for both of them.
Yes.
There's something so... It's 1994 for Cemetery Man.
Okay.
There's something so crazy and off the rails about Cemetery Man. Like, scene for scene, you do not know what you're going to get. A completely raunchy, like Red Shoe Diaries level sex scene on a gravestone.
Oh, yes.
Followed by a romantic scene between like this Igor figure and a hovering severed zombie head. The movie is so hella fucked. I love it. Yeah. I love it. I also say not for everyone, but I love it. Same thing with Dead Alive. This is not the first movie that ever had a guy take out a room full of zombies with a lawnmower, but it's probably the best movie that had someone take out a room full of zombies.
The director helps with that.
It is so crazy, over the top, violent. Like the actor is gasping for air as sheets of blood are falling on him. Like, it is absolutely crazy. I love it. It's from New Zealand. It's Gallagher seats. Like, it's one of these movies that you're either going to laugh all the way through or you're just going to have to leave the room. Yeah. But if it's your cup of tea, it is a delicious one.
And it was so close to being on my list. It's one of, more so than some of the other ones that we've been mentioning. And the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, entertaining, but I'm not quite sure. Then I saw it as a midnight movie at the Broadway Theater with an audience. That's the way to see that movie, because it was so much fun that way. And there's the baby sequence with the baby, which was so creative to me. That was like what I think a lot of zombie movies pale in comparison to that one. And another one, which would be a Peter Jackson directed film that's a little bit of a regret for me. It's not quite as effective, but The Frighteners is quite an interesting.
I have a soft spot for that movie, but I couldn't honestly put it on the list.
No, I know.
I do like that movie a lot.
It was close. They were, again, if it was a top 30, those two probably would have been on the top 30. So great choices, and I'm just. The list of regrets piles up. A Cemetery Man. I don't know why I thought it was late 80s, and so I didn't consider it because I had the wrong year.
Alas.
Which, I mean, I would be beating up the 15-year-old version of myself for not getting that right. So
it's a memorably crazy.
Oh, it is so good. It is so good. I in fact, I would recommend it. Not everybody's going to like it, but you need to find this movie and you need to see it if you like to be entertained. You know. Which most people do.
That'll wrap up the first of our two-part saga on the 1990s and what are the best horror movies of that particular decade. Tune in next week and find out the rest of the list, and send me your feedback. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Ranknreview@gmail.com. Also, please tell a friend about Ranknreview, and please keep an eye and an ear to the ground. Book of Trespasses will be coming sooner or later. Book of Trespasses, it's on its way.